Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, or good evening, good morning, good afternoon. That's the way I usually say it. Wherever you join us from around the world, welcome back to Creation Conversations, where we are dealing with a slightly controversial topic, even amongst creation researchers, but it's one to do with adaptation. And we're going to have a little bit of a look at the history of adaptation. We need to get the biblical picture of adaptation. And also, I mean, can creatures change? Can creatures develop new traits and adapt to environments? And all of these are big, important questions because you see it's an underlying acceptance in there of evolution often. And sometimes we use adaptation instead of using evolution, and the two may not necessarily be synonymous. So it's a big topic, it's an important topic, and it's one that we're going to delve down into tonight. Well, we've got almost our full team. We've got Dr. Diane Eager, we've got Craig Hawkins, John Mackay, and of course, Sam Jenkins as well. And we're going to kick things off with Craig and doing creation headlines, but I just want to share one very brief thing to begin with. You see, we've recently acquired at the museum a very large donation of over 600 copies of this magazine. The classic yellow National Geographic, right? Well, you see, there's over 600 copies that we've got dating back to the 1960s up until the 2010s. And, this one is dated August 1975. You can see it there, volume 148, number 2. Why do I want to show you this? Because if you go to page 234, you've got an article called "Will Coal Be Tomorrow's Black Gold rather." It's a bit out of date, as you can tell, because we're all about getting rid of coal nowadays, although it's interesting to see some of the research that creation research has been doing on coal. But the reason I bring this up is because if you just change, I mean, it's a very long article, almost 20 pages long about coal, but if you just turn over to page 243, you can see a rather spectacular polystrate tree. Now, this was one of the original ones that has ever been published and recognized as being a fossil tree, particularly one that cuts up through many, many layers of rock. But you see, it was published as an example of a fossil tree, and then there was no comment about it whatsoever. No comment about how it was discovered, where it was found, how it formed, or anything like that. Well, we're grateful to a team of researchers who actually tracked this tree down, because both John and I and Glenn have been out to this very tree, and it turns out that there's not just one tree, there's a whole bunch of them there. And so it's good to have the original copy of the National Geographic report that actually first documented that, and we're grateful to be able to have been able to go out and actually see the tree itself and find a whole bunch more. So yes, we do accept and gratefully receive any donations of old journals and science magazines, as well as any research books and so on and so forth, which is now obviously that's now pride of place in our museum collection as well as in our museum library. So do continue to pray for the work of creation researchers. We do this research and work as well as these surveys around the planet. But we're going to go over to Craig now, who's going to do creation headlines. So Sam, are we all up and ready to go with creation headlines?
Yep, ready to go.
All right. Craig, over to you.
Welcome to this week's edition of Creation Headlines, and we start with a live science news report that asks, did plate tectonics give rise to life? The report refers to new groundbreaking research on zircons, which are very hardy minerals that don't melt at mantle temperatures. Trouble is that the total number of these that we have measures less than a thimbleful. Nevertheless, these zircons apparently indicate that the Earth had water in the very early stages of its existence. Sounds very biblical, but the researchers speculate, and speculation is a major component of this research, that if there was early water, there may have been early tectonics, and therefore tectonics and cycling of nutrients may have been an important factor in the appearance of life. But Christians need not fear that this thimbleful of sand mixed with a good dose of wishful thinking has done away with the need for a creator. As one skeptical professor of geoscience, Mark Harrison, formerly of UCLA, has noted, the evidence is pretty minimal, and he worries that scientists are overconfident in their claims. He said, the last thing we need is a new form of groupthink based on literally a thimbleful of sand grains. Well, it's great to hear a scientist acknowledging groupthink, but let us now extend that criticism to the whole idea that life can spontaneously arise in the first place. Now to Kenya, where scientists have discovered footprints of humans and gorillas together in rocks they believe to be 1.5 million years old. Well, they do say that one is a footprint of human-like Homo erectus, and the other is a footprint of gorilla-like Paranthropus boisei. But let's not split hairs. What we are intrigued to know is how they actually distinguish between the human-like footprints of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, or between the two types of gorillas. What the evidence actually shows us is that humans and gorillas have always walked around in the same period of time. And this is supported by the fact that other footprints found in the study site included warthogs, antelopes, and horses. An interesting find, but from an evolutionary point of view, nothing to see here, folks. And finally, an article reported in The Conversation that really is worth forgetting. Psychologists have suggested that the art of forgetting is an evolutionary advantage. If you didn't forget things and replace it with new information, you might just load your brain or get yourself into a spot of bother. The report cites an example of early humans who regularly visit a waterhole only to one day chance upon a bear down there. You need to forget that going to the waterhole is a good idea and replace it with a memory of danger, or you might just be eaten by that bear next visit. Trouble is, you need to remember that the bear is dangerous in the first place, or you soon will become extinct, because the bear certainly hasn't forgotten that you are yummy. But seriously, despite great research on what drives memories, whenever scientists try to add evolutionary storytelling to the origins of complex features, they are denigrating the master designer who put them there in the first place. One might say these researchers are forgetting their place in creation. And the Bible says in Romans 1, they are deliberately forgetting the Creator. And that's all for Creation Headlines this week.
There we go. Thank you very much for that, Craig. That was great. And yes, we continue to bring you these creation headlines, and it's well worth actually signing up to the main Creation Evidence News, which comes out every couple of weeks or so. In fact, I think, Diane, is there a newsletter coming out in the next day or two, or has come out in the last day or two?
Not this week, but because we have our print newsletter,
Yes,
which is going out this week, and people who get that online will get a link to a PDF copy, and then we'll have a final electronic newsletter, the email type newsletter, the week after that.
And we'll probably include some of these creation headlines in those newsletters.
Yes. Mm.
So we do recommend that you go and sign up to that. It's free, and that's a wonderful benefit these days. And so you'll also get a great up-to-date set of information and news about the work that Creation Research does, as well as the things that are in the news and a bit of a creation spin on them as well. All right, our main topic then for tonight, adaptation. And, well, I'm going to kick things off with a little bit of a discussion about the historical side of stuff, because it really is important to understand the history. And then John's going to take over and deal with the biblical side of stuff. And so between John and I, we're going to really sort of lay the foundations of this topic. And then we're going to be looking at some evidence of adaptation and what the limitations of adaptation are and how adaptation works and all that kind of stuff for the rest of the program. Okay, so a little bit of history. I went to Down House just a couple of days ago. I've been on the road pretty much since the end of October, including to places like Poland and so on and so forth, right? Doing a great bit of ministry. And while we're on the road, we like to try and fit in a little bit of research when we can. It's one of the ways that we're able to do so much research at the kind of the finances and the cost that we're on, right, is because we try and make the most of every opportunity. Well, during this trip that I had, both obviously internationally, but as well as all over the UK, we visited several fossil locations, Hastings being one of them. And as I was driving back from sort of Kent back up to sort of north west London, I was passing by Down House, sort of on the outskirts of Orpington in London in the UK, which is, of course, where Charles Darwin lived. And it's where Charles Darwin really wrote and sort of developed his evolutionary ideas, and he ended up writing on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Now, I say the full title of the book, not just to sound impressive, right, but because the second half of the book, the title, the bit that everybody forgets, right, preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. You see, many people think that adaptation is synonymous with the thinking of evolution, and that may not be the case, but it certainly was the case that that's how Charles Darwin treated it. But Charles Darwin didn't come up with adaptation, despite the fact that if you Google adaptation, as John found out earlier, right? And he'll comment a bit more on this a little bit later. But you kind of get this idea that, well, Darwin was the first one to really develop the ideas of natural selection and adaptation. Of course, contested by Wallace, the naturalist traveling around, who sort of developed similar ideas at the same time and had a bit of an argument over who should publish them and get their ideas first. And there's no doubt about it, Darwin really sort of struck a home run with his book on the origin of species. But where did the idea of adaptation actually come from? And is it a new idea? And what is the connection with Darwin? And why did it suddenly take off in the way that it did? Because you see, we can go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who had a sort of a set of principles which were very, very similar, if not identical, to the idea of natural selection that we're dealing with today. You see, the ancient Greeks, although they initially started with a sort of polytheistic kind of way of thinking, right? Many, many gods, and their gods were just like us, but bigger and better, right? And we've used this example many times with regards to the way that they treated things like shark's teeth, right? They didn't believe that they were shark's teeth out of the rocks. They believed that they were tungstones, tricks played on us by the gods. But towards the end of the time of the Greeks, a few particular sects, particularly groups like the Atomists, they ended up adopting a much more naturalistic way of thinking, including this idea that life could arise from non-life, that given enough time, this life would continue to develop and would produce the arrival of what they called hopeful creatures. And the thinking was that these hopeful creatures, these select few of hopeful creatures, were ones that would be able to survive better with perhaps different traits than other creatures. These traits would arrive all by themselves. These hopeful creatures would go on to survive better. The other creatures would die off, and it was the hopeful creatures that would pass on their reproduction into other creatures and onwards and upwards. In other words, very similar to our modern day, or at least Darwinian thinking of natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. And many times those three phrases and words are used synonymously with each other. People think that natural selection means evolution, adaptation means evolution, and evolution, of course, everybody knows, means that slow, gradual change over vast periods of time from one type of creature into another type of creature. Well, again, you don't just make a link from Darwin to the Greeks. You go all the way down through the Middle Ages and pagan thinking influenced in the church and so on and so forth, down to the French revolutionaries who influenced the British sort of aristocracy, including Charles Darwin's family, particularly Erasmus Darwin, who wrote the great big book Zoonomia. I saw a copy of it in Down House, the very one that belonged to Charles Darwin, right? Erasmus Darwin wrote the book Zoonomia, again, effectively arguing that life can arise from non-life. Given enough time, these creatures would adapt and change, and if enough adaptation and enough change happened, eventually you'd end up with vast amounts of change over millions of years. So there still wasn't anything to do with Darwin. But the thing that Darwin really brought home was the idea of struggle for life, struggle for existence. I mean, he wrote it into the second half of his title on the origin of species. His belief that creatures changed because of their struggle for existence. Now, you see this because at Down House, they showed us a patch of earth, right, where Darwin performed experiments. He cleaned a patch of earth in the middle of his lawn. He made sure there was no life in there whatsoever. He even torched some of it to make sure it was completely dead. And he left it to its natural devices. And he was amazed at how many plants actually germinated and sprung up, how many weeds actually grew. I mean, over one season, he documented well over 300 of them germinated. And every time one would germinate, he would get a little piece of wire and he would stick it in next to the weed that was growing. But the thing that surprised Darwin even more, according to Down House and the signboard, right? The thing that surprised Darwin even more was just how few of them actually ended up surviving. At the end of that season, after almost 400 seedlings had germinated, just over 60 of them actually survived to grow into tough weeds. Caterpillars would eat them. Birds would fly down and peck them clean. And Darwin said, well, hang on a minute. This is now a struggle for existence. These weeds are struggling to survive. And so if you can have a weed that can produce a trait that makes it better to survive, Darwin said that that weed would then be a stronger one and more likely to be able to survive and go on to have plants, right, to germinate and to produce seeds, and therefore the generation of plants would continue. In other words, very similar to this old Greek idea of hopeful creatures. Darwin was basically looking at this idea of hopeful creatures. He called it natural selection. But you see, well, we've pointed out several times in creation research that natural selection only works if you've got a pre-existing population. I mean, it doesn't explain how you got that population in the first place. It only explains how nature selects for or against something. But Darwin noticed this struggle for existence. Of course, Darwin, and we've made this point several times as well, you see, Darwin graduated in theology. And this was back in the days where you actually had to read this book, right, the Bible, in order to graduate in theology. So there's no doubt about it that Darwin certainly ignored the bit that he saw in the beginning in Genesis chapter 3, where mankind fell and things like thorns and thistles came onto the planet. Because you see, Darwin thought that thorns and thistles were something that had naturally arisen in order to help a plant survive for better. So Darwin was really the first one to bring together, certainly in its greatest influence, this idea of struggle for existence that would lead on to plants being able to survive better. And he applied that same concept into all of life. You see, Darwin believed that these creatures could naturally produce traits that were different, and those traits would help that creature to survive, and on it would go. And he claimed that he had seen evidence of this. Now, he was still quite honest because he had a whole chapter about problems with his theory, in which he admitted that certainly the fossil record doesn't prove this or even support it. And living fossils are one of his biggest problems to evolution. But you see, Darwin, well, why did he think that new creatures could arise? Why did he think that new traits would be able to be developed? Well, you see, he had a very limited idea of what the cell was. In fact, he was borrowing ideas from the Greeks. The Greeks believed that creatures were made up of the same basic unit as things like trees, and trees are made up of the same basic unit as things like rocks. And well, Darwin believed that the cell was just a blob of jelly that could manipulate itself into anything that he wanted it to be. And so it seemed very simple that creatures would be able to produce new traits. He had no idea of things like genetics or anything like that, and we'll come a bit more onto the genetic side of things and the more biological side of things a little bit later with both Diane and Craig's examples. But you see, Darwin believed that these new traits could arise by themselves, and that given enough time with a bit of selection for or against, you would end up with brand new creatures that would develop after millions of years. And he claimed to have seen evidence of this on his travels in the Beagle, or on the ship, the Beagle, including things like differences in finches' beaks. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Darwin observed some change, and he observed the evidence of change. But the question was, is the step of faith that Darwin made a reasonable one? Because you see, Darwin said, well, if we can observe small changes over small periods of time, then surely over large periods of time, we will see large amounts of change. Now, What does that idea sound very similar to? The answer is Charles Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism. The idea that whatever is happening today has always been happening, and so the present is the key to understanding the past. Now, Lyell applied that to geology in order to get rid of God out of people's thinking, particularly to get rid of mosaic geology, as he called it. In other words, get rid of the idea of a global flood. Darwin, who was heavily influenced by the work of Charles Lyell, actually took that idea and applied it to biology and ran with it. But it wasn't an idea that Darwin came up with. It wasn't even an idea that Charles Lyell came up with. It was based on the much, much older pagan ideas of evolution that the ancient Greeks believed in. So you see, I wonder why nowadays when you Google adaptation or you Google natural selection or you Google evolution, it's Charles Darwin's name that comes up. Because he certainly wasn't the one who invented it. He was the one who certainly popularized it. Well, what's the evidence show? I mean, we're dealing with what is ultimately a pagan idea at its heart. We're using terms that are used synonymously today: adaptation, evolution, natural selection. In many people's minds, they mean the same thing. And so you have some people who say, well, snakes have adapted to be very, very venomous, or camels have adapted to live in the desert. And what most people hear is snakes have evolved venom. What most people hear is camels have evolved to live in a desert. And then they struggle to fit this into a biblical point of view. Well, let's try and give you the missing piece to the puzzle, the one that Darwin should have got, but he willfully chose to ignore, right? Which is this topic of good to bad to worse that we see in the scriptures. John, we're going to go over to you now.
Thank you, mate. And I sent you a text. When you move backwards, your mic seems to malfunction.
All right. I'll try and set that a little bit. There we go.
Okay, better put me on screen, Joe. We've had enough of your beauty. Okay, now my background, not a church family, not a Sunday school indoctrination, state school, public education, and it's very true what Joe said, but in my day, evolution was debatable, but the teachers would teach us how things had adapted, how they had changed. So we had evolution without the word evolution. Now, as we were discussing the background to this, Glenn, who's not here today, he was quite ill looking the other day. He brought up the fact that he'd had a young man, and the young man was dealing with the question of adaptation and selection, but he was using those words in a totally evolutionist framework and seemed to have no concept that they actually arose, as Joe said. You find if you look up your phone, go to the web. I was amazed when I did a little bit of hunting this morning, and the first thing that popped up was appropriate answers selected by artificial intelligence, right? They don't pay people to do this anymore. They've got a selection parameter, but every question I asked about adaptation or selection, the first answers that came up were Charles Darwin invented this. You might have got a bit of reference to Wallace or whatever, but it's Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin. So the artificial intelligence parameters that are used are excluding everything except evolution. So number one, beware. Next time I went in, I said, well, let's make this a bit more specific. Let's go and ask Encyclopedia Britannica, Britannica Online. And what was interesting is it said we had natural selection and adaptation ideas way before Charles Darwin. And it talks about the logic of man to fit these into pre-designed features. So adaptation was the ability of a creature to fit into an already designed environment. Look up Encyclopedia Britannica yourself, look for the word adaptation and see what you find yourself. Okay, now design, Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, all of these guys, there is no doubt about it that Charles Darwin already knew, because he picked the word origin of species for his book, not origin of genus, not origin of kind. And species, well, that's certainly a non-English word. It means special, but as in specially created. But he doesn't mention this. But genus is even more specific, because when Linnaeus came up with the genus and species system, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, because he read his Bible, he read it in Latin, he could even cross-reference it in Hebrew, and you find the word genus is in your Latin Bible, in Genesis chapter 1 10 times, each according to its own genus. So let's stop mucking around thinking that science grew up bereft of the Bible. The origin of the classification system, which really does work on living creatures and fossils, actually is a biblical concept. So don't be surprised that I'm going to give you some biblical principles, and then you'll be able to see, as Diane takes over in a little while before we have our first question time, the connection, joining the dots here. Genesis chapter 1, the world didn't happen by itself. In the beginning, it was created. In the beginning, not only was it created, a God, a being, a male plural being. That's what the word God means in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, actually brought it into existence. And by the time you read through the first two chapters, you've got Adam and Eve, you've got God saying at the end of chapter 1, and God saw everything he made, and it was very good. In other words, it was designed to survive. Everything needed everything else. So that when God told Adam he could eat fruit, there was no waiting for an orange tree to get fruit 5 years from now. I use 5 years because I planted plenty of citrus trees. And if I start with a little one, it's up to 5 years before I can get a decent crop from that. But in the beginning, it was all designed. It fitted together. So Adam could already breathe oxygen. His body didn't have to practice breathing oxygen and expelling CO2 or anything like that. These were actually pre-designed. They were adapted. So by the time I got to education, there was a real mixture. Adaptation was an inbuilt ability to cope with change. Now, that's not what it is in evolution. Adaptation is the body's ability to change to cope with change. No, that's not where it started. Adaptation was a design feature. Look at Encyclopedia Britannica online and have a look at what they say. It's worth noting the real history of this word in recent English thinking from 1600s onwards. But if you have your good to bad to worse, I've got my lovely old King James Bible here, and praise the Lord, even though I don't have it, I can still quote it in my head. Remember Genesis 1:31? God saw everything he made and it was good. That's how the world started. If you're saying what was selecting what, the answer was God had selected everything to survive and mutually support. Diane will take that up, I'm sure, but let's follow things through. By the time you get to the end of chapter 2, you've got Adam and Eve. By the time you get to chapter 3, you've got the coming of sin. By the time you get to the end of chapter 3, you've got sin, you've got thorns, you've got thistles. Now, at that point, what you and I call negative selection pressure enters the scene. So Adam and Eve were created without clothes on. Says so, Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And in Genesis chapter 3, when man sinned, God took skins. Animals died, blood was shed, so man could now be clothed. Not clothed because it improves your beauty, clothed because man minus God's holy covering cannot appear in the presence of a holy God. Now, that is not what you learn in school about where we got clothes from. It's cold in England, we need clothes. No, not in the beginning, it wasn't cold. There was no temperature selection, plus or minus. The world was very good. But now Adam sinned, you find God provides a covering, okay? But that means a creature died. So that creature was, in fact, supernaturally selected against. By the time you get to the serpent, who is now condemned to crawl along the ground, there's a supernatural process going on here. Now, but when you look apart from that, God says to Adam, from now, the ground will bring forth thorns and thistles. Now, I'm a bit of a bushy, and I don't think I wore shoes really until I got to be about 12 or 13. Not only were we a poor family, but I couldn't see any point in it. My feet were strong and tough, and I walked to school every day, no shoes. I walked in winter, no shoes. I walked in summer. I walked over the bushes. Occasionally, thorns and thistles would be a problem to me. Now, because my feet were so tough, now, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, with a name like Mackay, my background is Scottish. And the one thing I know is we Scots have the thickest sole feet on the planet. And when you look up some background, you find, hey, we live way up in the north. We were poor. We couldn't afford shoes. We might have, in wintertime, tried to keep our feet warm. But in reality, as I said to my dad, why did we live way up in the north? He said, that's as far as we could run and the British wouldn't chase us. Interesting. We have thick sole feet. That means, by the way, any thin-souled Scotsman didn't make it. The Brits caught them, executed them, or took them prison or something. So what you find is my feet, which every day walk over stones, even here, I don't bother with shoes. I grew up without shoes. I've got thick soles on my feet. But the presence of thorns means one thing. You can now get puncture wounds. You stand on a thorny bush, you can get puncture wounds. And unless you pull that out and disinfect inside, all sorts of diseases are now problematical, and they are now likely to occur. Now, diseases are not my field, they're Diane, so I'm going to hand over to her in a moment. But when you look at the first selection pressure, it'll be on our feet. Of course, man being made in the image of God, even though sin has defaced that image, God was the creator, so man is creative. I'm pretty sure we didn't take long to learn from what God had done. He killed an animal, he actually took a skin, and he clothed Adam and Eve. We're never told he made them shoes. It's not much of a leap from there. Hey, perhaps this nice thick skin covered with fur might work well for my feet. Perhaps if I soak it in tree bark and tan it, that's what the word means, it will actually last longer. I'll shave all the hair off so it doesn't pick up mud. And so you find, I'm pretty sure the invention of leather shoes or wooden shoes, which don't work that well in Australia, would actually come into existence pretty fast. So don't be surprised by the time you get through Genesis chapter 4, you discover a lot of inventions. So Cain has now killed his brother. Cain is told by God the ground will no longer yield to him. So you find the first hunter-gatherer in the descendants of Cain. They can't grow food for love nor money. So they have to hunt. They have to find things, and they have to exchange it with their brothers and sisters who still have the ability to grow. Interesting selection pressures here. Selection at society level. That by the time you get through chapter 4, you find Cain and you find his wife, you find everybody in there and it mentions that they invented metal tools. The first metal age, the first iron age, with Tubal Cain, who invented all of these metallic methods, was well over 1,000 years before Noah. So when you look at the history of man, we invent things because they make life more comfortable to us. We remove selection pressure through the use of technology, but that technology is there while Adam and Eve are alive. Okay, Diane, if you'd like to take over and talk about, adaptation, selection, feet, shoes, all those sort of things that are on creation, fact file and other places, take it away.
Yes, as Joseph mentioned, interesting history about how we've used different scientific terms in different contexts, and they do have to be understood in history. As John mentioned, we can look at the world around us now, but to really understand it, we need to know what the biblical history is. And so if we want to have a proper understanding of adaptation, we need to take those two things into account. So let's have a look at adaptation through a few examples which we have written about in our email newsletter, and see what we can learn from those. So if we could have my slides, Joseph. Okay, do we have...
Yep, that's all good to go.
Okay, we're ready to go. Good. I'll go back to... All right, what is adaptation? Well, let's start with a spectacular example. If I can just get the slide to move. Right. And it's from Australia, of course, because we have lots of spectacular things here. This is about a little creature that lives in the desert. And this is a report that we wrote about back in 2016. And it started out, the introduction to this scientific article started out with this comment: desert lizards such as the Australian thorny devil and the Texas horned lizard are spectacularly adapted to harvest environmental moisture using their body surface as a water collector. So which creature are they talking about? It's this one here, and its common name is the thorny devil. Its scientific name is Moloch horridus. And if ever a creature was burdened by a bad name, I think this has to win the prize. Moloch was one of the worst pagan gods that was ever invented. Really, you can read about Moloch in the Bible. Really, really horrible pagan god. And there were some pretty ghastly ones around at that time. And, well, the word horridus speaks for itself. But I have actually seen some of these creatures, and they're actually quite cute little fellas, and they're quite harmless. But how did they get this sort of spiky appearance? And what are the scientists talking about in their article about spectacular adaptation? Well, the standard story, if you read the ABC News in Science, that's the equivalent of the BBC, but in Australia, this is the standard story that you would get in any evolution textbook, but the ABC have summarized it rather nicely. Thorny devils can't simply lick water from puddles or drops of condensation because their entire mouth, including the jaw and tongue, has evolved specifically to feed on small ants that share their habitat. So this lizard has evolved a bizarre alternative to drinking with its mouth. The capillary channels on its skin squeeze out every last drop of moisture out of the arid landscape and push it towards the animal's mouth. So in fact, all of those spikes and these scales are well designed for capturing and conducting water through its skin. It's really, really clever. But how do they think that these things developed? Simply by this animal finding itself in the desert. Is this an example of spectacular adaptation? Well, if you look at this creature, yes, it does have small jaws and teeth, and it does eat ants. It does have water-conducting skin, and it can extract water even from wet sand. It can literally get a drink by just standing in some wet sand and sort of partially burying its body, or even throwing wet sand over the top of its body surface. This is a piece of really brilliant engineering, and in fact, this is actually a design feature. Because this creature does have small jaws and teeth, it can eat ants, whereas lots of other creatures can't. It has water-conducting skin so that it can extract water from shallow puddles and wet sand. So that means that thorny devils can live in the desert because they already have these features. They survive there because other creatures can't. And that's something that we need to understand. So to start with, this is a wrong use of the word adaptation. What they are looking at is a piece of brilliant design. And in fact, scientists are looking at thorny devil skin and seeing how we can make something that works in the same way to extract water from moist air and from moist ground for use in human technology. And by doing that, they are unconsciously acknowledging that it has to be a design feature because it requires engineers and scientists to look at it and use their brains. So thorny devils didn't arrive in the desert and then adapt. They survived there because they already had these as design features. So that's one wrong use of the word adaptation. What they really mean are design features. Now, here's another use of the word adaptation or adapted in another study where scientists claimed that snakes adapted their fangs according to what they eat. And this is the title of their science paper, Fang Evolution in Venomous Snakes, Adaptation of 3D Tooth Shape to the Biomechanical Properties of Their Prey. Now, what they did was they studied 81 species of snakes. So, yes, they went around, found 81 different species of snakes, and there's a huge variety in the shape and size of snake fangs. And what they did is they compared the structure and the strength and the sharpness of the fangs with what that particular snake mainly ate. And as you can see from the illustration there, snake fangs do vary a bit. You get sort of really long, thin, very spiky ones. that can be hinged out. You get shorter, more blunt ones. There are some snakes that are called rear fanged snakes, where they fangs aren't right at the front of their mouth. They tend to have sort of shorter and more blunter teeth. Anyway, after doing all of this, they worked out that snakes that had long, thin fangs tended to go for soft skin prey like mice, so small mammals with thin, soft skin, easily pierced by long, thin, sharp things. At the other end of the scale, snakes with more robust, blunt fangs tended to go for more harder skin prey, and there is actually a crab-eating snake that can eat crabs with an exoskeleton, but there are other snakes that can eat arthropods, so, right, things that have an exoskeleton. And in between that, you've got snakes with varying thicknesses and sharpness of their fangs, and they tended to go for sort of intermediate things like more scaly reptiles, fish, things like that. And there are so it certainly fits that the sort of fangs that a snake has, if you want to go around studying snakes' fangs, a bit of a hazardous sort of thing to do, you might get a clue as to what they eat. Well, all that seems fairly much common sense to me. But anyway, this was the sort of conclusions they came up with, establishing the relationship between fang morphology, in other words, fang shape and structure, fang morphology and diet helps to explain how snakes became adapted to different lifestyles. So notice the assumption there. The available food resulted in a change in the structure of the snake's fangs. Now, does that actually work? Well, you think about it just in terms of common sense observations in the world. What would happen if a mouse-eating snake, so one with the long, thin, sharp fangs, tried to eat crabs? Or the other way around? What if the crab-eating snake with more blunter, robust, thicker fangs tried to eat mice? Well, the sharp fangs would break on the exoskeleton, and the thick, blunt fangs, well, they'd have a hard time piercing the mouth skin. So either way, the snake would lose out. And in fact, when you have unsuitable teeth for the sort of prey that you want to try and eat, you'll end up dying out. Whereas if you have suitable teeth for whatever's available, you'll survive. Okay, trying to eat the wrong food is not going to change your teeth. So this is another misuse of the word adaptation, right? What you've got in this example is selection. So long, thin, sharp fangs work well for soft skinned prey. So snakes that had those and lived in an environment where there were mice or other small mammals, they would survive and the other ones would die out. So what you've got here is an example of natural selection, which everyone assumes means evolution. However, it is a real process, but it will not make anything evolve. It will not make a snake with long, thin fangs turn into a rear-fanged snake with blunter fangs. So all it does is to sort out the variation that already exists. So what we need to do is have a closer look. What actually is adaptation? Forget about what the evolutionists are trying to tell us. Just think of it in terms of a plain ordinary English word and use your observations and your own common sense. Those things do matter. Don't let anyone bluff you by using words in a technical sense unless they can actually explain that. So what is adaptation? And are there any real examples? Well, if you look up an English dictionary, the word adapt just simply means to make something suitable for a new use or a new purpose, or to modify it, or it does mean to become adjusted to new conditions. So it can be a verb in that sense of the word as well. Now, you can only modify something or change it to make it suitable for a new use if it already exists. You can't adjust or modify anything that doesn't exist. So adaptation is not going to produce any new traits, any new features. So let's have a look at a real example. Now, John mentioned feet. All right. So let's have a look at feet, because they are, in fact, a very good example of some real adaptation. We've looked at reptile skin. So what about human skin? All right. Well, we can't stand in water and get a drink. Our skin is designed for other functions. And if you want to walk around barefoot, well, there are some nice places to do that apart from the wilds of Scotland. You can come and walk on the beach, and that's very pleasant. And you get the sensation of sand and water, and that's really nice. So the skin on the feet has two functions, right? It does protect us from what's underneath, and it also is a sensory organ. We can feel the ground, and that's just not so that we can enjoy the feel of sand and water. That is important for being able to walk properly. We need all that sensory input. But we don't always walk in nice places like that. In fact, we can walk in places that actually damage our feet. And so hard, sharp surfaces damage skin. So how does the body respond to that? Right, the skin makes that thick, tough layer that is particularly thick in Scotsmen, but in people who generally walk around bare feet on tough surfaces. And just as an aside, if you think about how that could evolve, well, if we had to wait for evolution to make calluses over many generations, how many half-evolved humans endured blisters and cuts and abrasions, and with their potential for infection and pain and discomfort before the genes for callus production evolved? Anyway, so calluses are actually limited as to how much protection they can provide. As John commented there are some things that can pierce even calloused feet. So human beings invented shoes. Good invention. There is a problem with shoes in that you do lose some of the sensation, which is essential for good walking. And that led some scientists to think, well, I wonder if calluses produce a loss of sensation. So they observed that, yes, skin does respond very well in thickening itself up and producing a callus, which is good protection. But is there a sort of trade-off with a loss of sensation? Well, they actually did a study on this. Interesting things you can study in science. Fancy a study of people's bare feet. I think we'd want to wash them first. But anyway, the result of this was, in contrast to shoes, and this is the report from the scientists who did this study, in contrast to shoes, callus thickness does not trade off protection measured as hardness and stiffness. In other words, really good, effective calluses, right, do not trade off the ability to perceive tactile stimuli, right, at frequencies experienced during walking. So they actually did a relevant test. In other words, what sort of stimuli do you get from actually walking on bare surfaces with bare skin? So here we have an example of a real adaptation, right? Walking on soft surfaces, you don't need those extra layers, so the skin stays soft and sensitive. If you walk on a hard surface, the skin builds up extra layers for protection and the sensitivity is maintained. However, as John mentioned, there is a limit to how much just forming calluses on the skin is going to work, particularly if you're in an area where there are lots of very fierce penetrating things like thorns and thistles and other things. So it's not surprising that we still need shoes in the fallen world. So don't throw your shoes away if you think, oh, well, I can save some buying some expensive athletic shoes, which are very expensive these days. I'll just go walking around on the hard ground. It's in the fallen world, it's not going to work. We still do need shoes. So, and that is a reminder that adaptation can only go so far. We didn't evolve shoes by walking on dangerous ground. We had to invent them because we live in a fallen world. So let's go back to our original question. What is adaptation? Right. It is the ability to adjust in response to changes in the environment, and going from a very good world to a fallen world was a very big change in the environment, and there was changed activity. We needed to do things that we didn't need to do in the very good world where we lived in the Garden of Eden. Adaptation is actually a design feature that requires forward planning. It modifies already existing features and won't produce any new features. You can't modify something you don't already have. So what is adaptation? It's a real biological process, but it's not evolution, right? It's actually a design feature that's built in by the creator. And if you would like the original references to these 3 studies plus various others, they are available on our fact file. And if you have other questions about what is or isn't evolution, there are some questions that are relevant to that on the Ask John Mackay site. Now, if we can come back to us, I'm sure we've got some questions and maybe some thank yous as well, if we can come back.
My question is, can we literally say that John is thick?
I prefer the word Scott, SCOT.
Oh, they're synonymous, are they?
Depends on which end of the body you're talking about.
All right, Sam. Thank you, Sam.
I'm muted. Apologies. Right, there we go. So let's have a look and see what we got here. So we got a super sticker coming in for 5 British Buckaroos. Super Dog saying, "Hey you," greeting joyfully. Hey you. Hi. Got Doki Doki Bible Club coming in with super sticker, 149 US Buckaroos. A red box of popcorn. Thank you, Doki. God bless you. We've also got as well another super sticker from Doki Doki, 149 US Buckaroos. A pink ice cream cone. Lovely jubbly. Douglas Buffy coming in with a 10 British Buckaroo super sticker. Sunglasses perpetually fall onto video game controllers' proud face.
I've not seen that one before.
I am struggling to process that one, if I'm perfectly honest. You have to just have me just headbutt my microphone. There you go. Right, there you go. We've also got as well a super sticker for 10 Aussie Buckaroos. A hippo character collapses to the ground as his chair breaks. That's definitely not happening. I can't afford another one. While the words Rex appear above him. Thank you very much, little old me.
I think people are just deliberately trying to find the most outlandish.
Yeah. We've got another one from Doki Doki coming in for 149 US Buckaroos. A sliced cherry pie. Lovely jubbly. Right, let's do a question. Apologies, I had to dip out for a couple of minutes. But this is an interesting one here. Question from Doki Doki. Why should we care about endangered species if evolution is sorting things out for us?
Okay, I'll start with this one. And the answer is, evolution involves no concept of care or concern or anything like that. You see, what we are doing here is mixing Christian values, where God told us to care for the environment, right, to care for the planet, because it's his planet. It's not ours. He gave it into our dominion, and we are held accountable for what we do with it. In evolution, it doesn't matter one iota if anything dies out, because so what? It got here by chance in the first place. If you're worried about mosquitoes dying out, remember there was once a time when there was no mosquitoes, and most of you would be very grateful for it to die out. But as an orchid grower, I wouldn't, because it fertilizes some of my orchids. So mosquitoes do have really good purposes, but they've added a few extra ones, like sucking blood when there's not enough hemoglobin in the plants to keep them alive. So my answer is, it wouldn't matter one iota if anything dies out. And kids need to get to learn that evolution is mindless, it's emotionless, it is careless, right? And need all of those things. Diane, you got any comments on that?
Yes, I think there's an interesting sort of hypocrisy here that according to evolution, everything is struggle, and it's only because some things die out that other things are allowed to survive. So a lot of environmentalists who would believe in evolution don't actually want it to happen. So that's a good point that's made in the question.
And it's actually interesting that there's a lot of resources in government and industries out there to research, report on, and protect endangered species. So yeah, it's actually a huge industry or business, if you like.
Mm.
I'm thinking of the polar bear example because of the climate change gurus. You know, the interesting thing is kids are worried about polar bears dying out because the ice is melting, and there's not a thing you can do about it. Right? In reality, if the polar bears die out, then they didn't adapt, they didn't evolve, they found no survival function. On the other hand, nobody ever worries about penguins evolving at all. So when you have a look at it, the whole mishmash of mixture of Christian values, which is what caring for the environment is, with evolutionary nonsense, is producing, as Craig rightly pointed out, an unbelievable amount of money thrown at nothing that they've got any suggestion or solution for.
And I think that partially comes down to the reasoning behind why we do things. So we look after the planet that God has given us because it's His planet and because He has given us dominion over the planet, which means that we have a responsibility, if you like. We are to be good stewards of the world that God has given us. But the atheist or the evolutionist or the climate activist or the environmentalist, they come from a very, very different point of view. They argue that we need to look after the environment because the environment has just as much of a right to exist as we do, whether that be an ant or whether that be a polar bear, right? Because we all evolve from the same common ancestor. Therefore, they are elevating creation to not only the same level as us, but they are accelerating us to the point of, or to the level rather, of God. You see this when David Attenborough stood up and basically said at COP26, if together we have destroyed the environment, then only together can we be the saviors of the world. Now, that's elevating man to the point of God, and Romans chapter 1 in particular warns us against two things. Number one, putting ourselves as God, and denying the creator ultimately. But number two, it warns us against worshipping the creation or the creature rather than the creator. And so if once you've rejected God's authority and that same dominion that we get or we have been given over the planet comes ultimately from God's authority, once you reject that, anything goes. And so we now end up with this bizarre mishmash of, yes, we need to look after the planet, even though it doesn't make logical sense in an evolutionary worldview. We're going to look after the planet because we've elevated ourselves to God and the creation to the same as us, effectively.
Well, I'll throw in one moral dilemma that I faced on my property, which is out on the edge of the city, a lot of bush, a lot of trees I've planted. I've got dogs and I've got snakes. Now, the interesting thing is I came across this situation. We have a broad-mouthed snake and it's got a sort of a rough scales and a ridge back. Now, this has hit the scientific literature because of how it's adapted or evolved. Here's what I saw. My dog and I were walking through the long grass. Here's a snake ahead of us, not even conscious of us coming. We're pretty quiet, both the dog and I, as we walk through the bush. And it spotted a toad that its mouth is just big enough. You know, the cane toads we imported from the USA that are toxic if you eat them or smoke them, as some of the hippies do, dry the skin and turn them into sort of cigarette filling. And what you find is the snake was actually crawling up and the toad couldn't hear a thing. Snakes are real quiet crawlers. And I thought, do I yell and say, get out of here, toad? Or do I let the snake, who would bite my dog otherwise, and it's moderately toxic, or me if I didn't see it, and if it eats the toad, it's going to die. And in fact, Diane, you and I have got plenty of articles that we've written on how these snakes have adapted to become smaller mouths they've evolved smaller mouths because the smaller mouth ones can't eat the toads. They can't fit them in, so they can't get the toxin. And in reality, it didn't evolve a smaller mouth because I've had them long enough on my property. There's big mouth ones like this big mouth people, and there's smaller mouth ones. But on my property, the big mouth ones are all disappearing because they eat the toads. Now, does this remind me of a game we used to play when we were kids? Because we believed then that we had the right to kill off the toads. They were imported creatures, so we'd play golf with them. People would use their air rifles, which are pretty much banned these days, and practice shooting with them. Or do you get a cigarette and put it in the toad mouth and it swells up because the nicotine stops its apparatus? I mean, all cruel examples beyond a shadow of a doubt. But if you remove the toad, this problem doesn't happen for the snake, and then it goes back to biting me or the dog. So, Diane, you want to comment on those things?
Yes, we did actually write about a study of those things, and one of the reports we read called it "Survival of the Pinheads," and so and and that's exactly what happened. Snakes of this one particular species do come in variety. There is variety within species, and so some of them have fatter heads than others. And what was happening is that the fathead snakes could eat bigger toads, which means they got a bigger dose of poison, so they died. The thin-head snakes could only eat very small juvenile toads or immature toads, so they didn't get as big a dose of poison, so they survived. And so after a few generations, the dominant form of that particular species was narrower heads. And this was put forward as an example of evolution. Now, this is a classic example of natural selection. The toads are a selecting agent. They have selected out the fathead snakes and enabled the thin-head snakes to then dominate the population. So there is a shift in the population, but the snakes are still the same species, so no evolution here. Classic example of evolution, of natural selection rather, but not evolution. And the evolutionists are conflating those two terms. It goes back to the problem that we talked about at the beginning of this program, where you've got a mismatch of all of these different terms thrown in together to make people think that evolution is the real history and the real explanation of what we've got going in the world. And so what we're doing tonight is to try and unpack that and look at what these individual processes are. Real biological processes, none of them are evolution.
I solved my moral dilemma by talking to the snake and saying, I wouldn't do that if I were you, and walked away. I have no idea what happened next, but since I have no broad-mouthed snakes anymore, I've got a good idea.
Very good. Well, I think we've got a couple more quick thank yous, Sam, and then we should probably move on with the program. I'm going to leave you. What's that, sorry?
Right. I was just going to say we only got on one question. We took a long time to answer it.
Well, that's true.
It was a good question and it was relevant.
It was. We want to make sure we've got enough time to deal with the last couple of things that we're going to be working through.
Right. Thank you to Doki Doki for 2 US buckaroos. Fan character wearing heart-shaped sunglasses. You'll have to deal with a heart-shaped monocle, I'm afraid. But there we go. And also we've got Who Little Me coming in with 10 Aussie buckaroos. Shiba dog rolling on the floor, laughing out loud. I'll go off camera. There you go. That's the best you're going to get, unfortunately. Right.
Great stuff. Thank you for that, Sam. And we will come back to questions towards the end if we've got some time. But we're going to go on now to a section by Craig, and then John's going to begin to wrap things up before we come back to questions. I'm going to say goodbye and leave you in the capable hands of Sam and John and Craig and Diane, who will finish off the program. I'm not feeling too well, so I'll see you guys next week. But goodbye and God bless, and we'll catch you later. And Craig, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, well, this whole subject on adaptations is a difficult one. It's quite complex. There's lots of, sort of difficult concepts to get your head around, but it's really important for Christians to realise just what's involved with it, because it's the initial introduction that kids get at school to evolution. In fact, when you go on the Australian curriculum website, if you search adaptations, what comes up automatically is adaptations and then in brackets evolution. So it is the initial introduction to evolutionary concepts, and they're trying to say that adaptations are the process basically of evolution and what evolution uses to advance creatures. Check that out. It's in grade 5, grade 6. I've often been asked to teach students in primary schools adaptations with seahorses, and I will do it, but I will do it in a way that only talks about real adaptations and not evolution as such. So I want to answer a couple of basic questions and then give some examples in the real world. But Sam, if you could put my slides up, that would be great. Thank you. So what is an adaptation? And Diane has answered this, and there's slight variations to the way that we can answer it. But I've summarized it like this. It's a change by which an organism becomes better suited to its environment according to the typical definition, the evolutionary one. And this is what they'll use. If you go on to some of these curriculum websites, it's a change by which an organism becomes better suited to its environment. We're going to go through a couple of examples of that. But this raises a few questions. For example, is that ability to change unlimited? Is that how we get from amoebas through to human beings? What happens when it cannot change? And we've just had a few examples of that with snakes. And another question we should ask is, well, how much have creatures changed and what's the evidence for that? I think this is a better definition. This is my effort at it. And similar to Diane's, a pre-existing ability to change in order to cope with change, without which an organism will become extinct. Maybe I should have added in the fallen world. So God has made everything good in the beginning, but because of the fall, because of sin, and because of major changes like the flood, his incredible design, his genius in design has allowed creatures to survive some of those changes that have occurred. So a classic example that's given to us is giraffes. They've adapted, they've evolved a tall neck so that they can eat high food. Now, the sensible person or the thinking person would ask, well, what would happen if it needed that food but didn't already have a long neck? Well, the answer is it'd starve and it'd die, it'd become extinct, and you wouldn't have giraffes. So is it a reasonable question to ask? Did giraffes already have high necks and they've just utilised that for eating food at heights? And what other things would need to change if you evolve a long neck? What other things need to suddenly change? Well, I think Diane would be a good one to answer that, with things like your heart and your nervous system and the muscles in your neck and all sorts of things need to change so that you can survive. Well, here's some examples of adaptations that are real. So we're not denying that adaptations are actually things that happen. Red chickens and foxes. John might like to expand on that one later. Mussels in freshwater and saltwater. They can handle both types of water, as can some other creatures like salmon, for example. Rabbits in Australia, a disease called myxomatosis was brought in to try and wipe out the rabbit plague that had increased in the 1800s in Australia. But eventually a few rabbits survived, and rabbits now thrive again based on the original ones that could survive myxomatosis. Blind cavefish, well, they've adapted blindness, if you like. They've lost eyesight. They've got smaller eyes. They've got skin covering the eyes, so that in dark caves they don't bash their eyes, damage them, and get disease. Dog's hair in winter can get thicker. My dogs are shedding their hair now as the summer months come on. And athletes at high elevation adapt to take in more oxygen, and that's why a lot of athletes will train at high elevation before an event. Okay, so here's some challenges to our viewers to think, well, which ones of these are real adaptations and which ones are actually design features? And I noticed Douglas Boffey asked a really good question there. How much is adaptation due to gene degeneration and how much to original design? Well, that is an excellent question and really gets to the nub of what we need to try and answer from a creation perspective. So thick soles of human feet from walking barefooted. Well, we've already given that one away. What about sea dragons and their camouflage, the leafy appendages that they've got and their ability to change colour somewhat? What about a gecko and their sticky feet to climb walls? Is that an adaptation? The evolutionists would call it an adaptation. What about the Kia parrot, which I've got a picture of there? It learnt to eat meat when their vegetable food sources were diminishing. What about dinosaurs developing feathers, which isn't something we would say has happened at all, but is that really an adaptation? What about light bones for flying birds? They had to evolve these light bones. They adapted their bones to enable flying. And what about animals changing to nocturnal behaviour for safety? So have you had a bit of a think about those? Well, these are the ones that I think are real adaptations. We've obviously already talked about bare feet. The parrot has adapted its behaviour. So behaviour can be behaviour can be an adaptation as well as feature in the body. And the animals changing to nocturnal behaviour, it can be an adaptation in their behaviour as well. And here's an example in a scientific paper on that, where a global study on temporal dynamics of mammals suggests that irrespective of ecosystem type and taxa, many species become markedly more nocturnal in response to human disturbance. But we can actually answer this one from a biblical point of view as well, because after the flood, the Bible says this: the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. So whether this was something that God applied to the creatures there and then, or whether that was something that just happened in their behaviour because of events around the flood, we can't be 100% sure of, but it's certainly something that's mentioned in the Bible that happened post-flood. It's a behavioural adaptation, if you like, that they will fear humans because we are going to eat them all. And they need to take that into consideration. Okay, so some general principles that we need to take on board regarding adaptations is that, as Diane has already said, change is a real thing. Natural selection is a real thing. Adaptation is a real thing. But we've got some qualifiers from a creation perspective that we need to take into consideration. And that's God's creative genius. He is a brilliant designer and he can do whatever he wants with his creation, and he's inbuilt genetic and behavioural variations into creatures, possibly even, we can't be 100% sure, but most likely with his understanding of the fall and the flood in advance. But it's something from the creation model that there are limits to possible variations. So God made things according to their kinds. Variations and adaptations are not going to enable a created kind to change into some other sort of kind, and it doesn't permit evolution. So it's within a created kind and it's using the existing genes. It's not inventing new genes. These adaptations, in fact, may involve the loss of genes and some mutations, but they've got to be ones that ultimately do not kill things. So the blind cavefish I've already briefly mentioned, but they're originally designed and created with eyes, and over through periods of natural selection, they have adapted to having no sight and smaller eyes. The bigger eyed fish without skin coverings are more likely to damage themselves bumping into protrusions in caves in the dark, and therefore get disease and infections and die more quickly. So that seems to be a real adaptation. And we accept as well natural selection, but it always leads to specialization and increased risk of extinction. So you're concentrating the genes in a particular group of animals of that species, and therefore they're becoming more and more specialized. And because you're specialized, if some sort of variation occurs in your habitat or in your environment, then you actually become more likely to become extinct. And perhaps here is an example of that. This is the spotted handfish. Now, we're one of the few places on the planet, in fact, the only place on the planet that you can see some of the handfish. We're in part of the Australian threatened species recovery team for this species and the red handfish. And we've got a new display that we've made for the public to see these. And this has just been opened in the last week, where tourists can now come into this area and see some of these fish. You can see one of the species at Melbourne Aquarium as well, but the red handfish you can only see here. And in behind that wall, we've got a special breeding facility that we've set up for them. So this is showing our care for God's creation, our desire to not see this species become extinct, or any of these species become extinct, because they are literally one of perhaps the rarest fish on the planet. There's only a few thousand of the spotted handfish left, and this one, the red handfish, there's only believed to be about 100 left in the wild. So just a little bit about them. This is the red handfish. They're actually part of the anglerfish family, and so they've got that elysium, that lure on the forehead there that are well known in the anglerfish. And the handfish are said to have these adapted pectoral fins, these extended pectoral fins that allow them to walk on the substrate because they don't have swim bladders. The swim bladder normally enables a fish to stay buoyant, but these don't have them, so they spend most of their time on the bottom of the ocean. And they can swim up, but it takes them a lot of energy, and then they just sink back to the bottom. It's actually quite funny to watch. So there's a top view of the red handfish, and you can see those odd-looking pectoral fins extended out to the side. This is the spotted handfish. It's got the same enlarged pectoral fins. It's also critically endangered. These ones are only known around southern Tasmania, in and around the Hobart estuary region of the Derwent River. Now, one of the reasons that they've become very rare is because their habitat is being consumed by starfish, introduced starfish. The Pacific sea star, as you can see on the bottom photo there, consumes these ascidians, and these stalked ascidians are where the handfish lay their eggs. In the red handfish's case, it seems to be sea urchins that are destroying the seaweeds that they lay their eggs on as well, and the seagrasses. So what humans are trying to do now is to add artificial spawning habitats, so the starfish and the sea urchins won't eat them, and these ceramic spawning habitats are being put out in the wild. There's been thousands of them put out in the wild, and they have been observed to be used in the wild. That's actually an example in captivity in our facility, where we have these beautiful fish trying to spawn, and we're trying to raise them. We actually have successfully raised some and reintroduced them back into the wild. And it's great to know that after more than a year, some of them have been found to have survived. So they're an odd-looking fish in a lot of ways, but they're actually a type of anglerfish. And here's some interesting facts with anglerfish, that most of them do not have swim bladders. All anglerfish pretty well don't have swim bladders. And most of them actually use their pectoral fins to, well, walk on, if that's a word you want to use, at least use their fins to move around on the substrate. All the anglerfish have elysiums, the lure on the forehead, and many of them have small scale spines. So when you look at them closely, there's a little protrusion in the scales on the skin. You might just be able to make out some of them there on that picture. But there are variations within the kind. So these are two different species. They've both got that elysium, but there's just slight variations to that elysium. Maybe a bit of colour, maybe some of the extensions on it, maybe the length, maybe the shape slightly, but there are variations. And there are variations in the fin rays as well. The arrow there going to the spotted handfish on the left. That's the bones that come out of the back there and help support the fin and move the fin. The spots and markings obviously can vary, and the shape and number of body spines. So you can look up close at some of these spines and you might just see one of the species has a single spine. Some of them have a double spine that come out very similar, but just a double spine, some shorter, some longer. So there's definitely variation within this group of fish. But are these variations examples of different created individuals, or are they just variations within a created kind? I tend to think at least all the handfishes are part of the created kind, but it's possible that the anglerfish are all part of the created kind, that the one created kind, and the variations have occurred post-fall, post-flood in the actual whole anglerfish group. And we can't be too dogmatic about that. We don't want to push that point too hard, but there's certainly variation within a kind. And here's an example, these fin rays. So there's two Brachyonychthes, the spotted handfishes. There's the Australian spotted handfish and then the spotted handfish, which is the one in Tasmania. And look at the number of fin rays. So in the spotted handfish in the middle there, it has a range of between 17 and 19, but mostly 18. In the Australian spotted handfish on the left there, it has between 16 and 18 fin rays, but mostly it has 17. So you can see inbuilt variation even within the one species, but one of the variations in the other species might just be that it's averages one less of these fin rays. Now, in a different genus, the red handfish, it still has a very similar number, but still a variation of 16 or 17 fin rays. So there's a classic example of variation within a kind, and this is a variation that's actually used in species identification and classification. So we've got to admit some questions that we don't know in this whole thing. If we had the resources of the scientific institution, some of these questions might well be answered by now, but these are some of the questions from a creation perspective that should be asked. Were handfish and anglerfish created with or without a swim bladder? Is a swim bladder something that was lost in the anglerfish, and therefore through natural selection, larger pectoral fins then were something that developed in the species? Were handfish and anglerfish designed to walk on pectoral fins, or is that an adaptation through that natural selection? These are questions we can definitely not be too dogmatic on. We don't know, and it's something that might be looked at in the future. But is there any evidence that handfish have actually evolved? Well, here's the earliest known fossil of handfish. It's been generally accepted now as a handfish from the Eocene and the evolutionary timescales period, so some tens of millions of years old, but it's still a handfish. It's still recognisably a handfish, and there's no precursors to that known. So the question is, how much have creatures really changed? And we've done this many times on the show. This actually comes from a presentation I've done to some of the school students, so we won't labour on this too much. There's a pipefish, there's a fossil pipefish. They haven't changed. The nautilus hasn't changed. Scallops haven't changed, even though that's a Permian aged rock according to the evolutionary system, which is 250 million years old. Scallops are still scallops. The evidence out there in the fossil record really is things haven't changed. Now, with sharks, they're often said that they've got a body shape that's adapted to swim in water. They're sleek swimmers. They've adapted this body over time. But the Baltimore Aquarium says this, that sharks appeared suddenly 45 million years ago and have changed very little since. So how have they had time to adapt this sleek body shape? By their own admission, they're saying that they appeared suddenly and they've changed very little. There's no evidence out there in the fossil record that sharks have adapted or evolved that body shape. They just had it from the beginning. They're actually designed. That's actually better evidence for design and creation. And that's where we get to, that sharks have really been designed from the beginning. That's not an adaptation at all, even though that's what your school students would be told, even in primary school. So the ultimate question is that obviously we come to with this subject is, where did creatures come from, and have they adapted and changed over millions of years in a changing world from single cells to humans? Obviously, in this program, we're coming from the creation perspective, and the real evidence is that things have been designed incredibly, and they've got inbuilt but ultimately limited capability to vary, and that's the best alternative, I think, that fits the evidence. So back to the whole team. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Craig, for that. If you can put us all up on screen there. Great presentation there, Craig. Probably provoked a few thoughts. I'll throw in one, and then we'll take perhaps one last question because our time is running a limit. Diane and I have worked on snake legs and leg snakes and legged animals and the loss of those legs. And in terms of your number of fins and spines and that, it may in the end be found that there's a connection between hands and spine length, etc. There certainly is in terms of snakes. If you lose the limbs in snakes, for some reason or other, that loss actually generates more vertebrae in the backbone. We won't go into that today. You can actually look up our website and look at snake size and things like that. But there's lots of things, as Craig said wisely, we don't know the answer yet, but the fossils tell us one thing: there's no evolution at all, regardless of the concepts of adaptation or natural selection, which originally were Christian creationists, biblically based. And those ones work. The evolutionary ones don't work. Okay, Sam, any more thank yous? Any questions?
You're on mute, Sam.
There we go. It'd help if I unmuted. Yes, we've got a super sticker here from Doki Doki, 2 US Buckaroos, a hand doing a fist bump. There you go. Right. Okay. So I think we'll do a few quick fire questions. So quick answers, please. This one comes in from Who Little of Me. Who dreams up these Latin names?
Probably.
Well, the Latin's got meaning. The Latin names have got meanings. So hirsutus, for example, just means hairy, referring to the little spines they've got all over their body. Brachionictes, hirsutus, yeah.
It was just picked because hardly anybody spoke Latin, so therefore the names would be guaranteed to not change. Next question.
Right. Here we go. Question for Douglas Buffy. Has the evolution dogma adapted to the evidence?
Answer: no, because my textbooks at university said the fossils don't show any evolution. In fact, there's one textbook said once they appear, creatures appear to remain inherently stable, so evolution does not adapt to the evidence at all. It actually just proceeds to ignore it because of a blatant atheistic, anti-Christian philosophy. So that's probably enough said on that one.
Well, can I just add, it's the underlying worldview that is unchangeable. So when we find things like biological material in dinosaur bones, they don't ask the question, well, does that mean dinosaur bones aren't as old as we believe? No, they won't even go there. They immediately explain it away that these biological materials can last tens of millions of years when they never believed that in the past.
Yep. Right, question from Who Little Old Me. What did snakes eat before the fall?
Diane?
Vegetation.
Well, we're told that all animals were to eat plants. So snakes ate plants. They don't eat plants now. The world has definitely changed, but it hasn't evolved.
And you can actually go to YouTube and search for snakes eating berries and things like that. And there's quite a few film bits there, amazing, where the snakes reach up, grab a berry or a piece of fruit, and their teeth are well adapted for plucking fruit, right? There's spaces between it, and they would still need venom in their teeth because they can't chew. Whether it's fruit or people, they can't chew. So therefore, the venom in the body of the creature actually is a necessity before it swallows it, unless its stomach acids are still good enough to dissolve something, because many of the snakes are non-venomous and they can eat as well. Their body just has to work harder inside. We'd probably better round it up there, Sam. Thanks to the team, and pray for Joe as he's not been well. But he's really grateful for those of you in the southern part of England. The snow has got the Christmas Day parade for their town called off. So don't go to Oswestry expecting to see Santa Claus riding dinosaurs leading you to the Creation Discovery Centre. That's not going to happen. But it has been good. Remember the principle that we have. Start with God's word, because he was there and he designed things, knowing full well as an omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscience. He knew what would happen even if we didn't. So he's built creatures in to survive, unless you and I get out of control and we shoot off all the buffaloes or do whatever we can with motives other than that which is God honoring. So keep in mind that we will be held accountable for what we do with the creation. So when you're in Tasmania, pop in to see Seahorse World and their handfish, world class, world first preservation display, and then just duck along to the other end of the building and visit our Creation Discovery Centre. So that's all for today. Goodbye and good bless, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.